Parliament Introduction VD Dua, MP Singh and Rekha Saxena. Comparative Constitutional Crucibles. The legislative branch of the government in the theory and the practice in modern comparative politics has broadly speaking either evolved through a long historical process of struggle for supremacy among the various governmental organs, or it has been created in a constitutional compact in the wake of a momentous war or revolution. The sovereign British Parliament was the product of the first process, and the United States Congress of the second. The case of the Parliament of India would appear to be different from both its British and American counterparts. This is so is the process of its emergence or creation as well as its principle and operating norms. Process-wise, India did not go through a long drawn-out struggle between the Parliament and the Crown as in the United Kingdom, nor did it to go through something similar to the American War of Independence, in which the 13 rebellious British colonies cut off imperial rule and established an independent republic under the first written constitution of modern world. The anti-colonial nationalist movement that led to India's independence from the British colonial rule in 1947 was largely a legal transfer of power under a statute of the British Parliament. Independence of Indian Act 1947. The transformation of the India from the colony to a nation state was nonetheless neither entirely legal or peaceful, as was the case of the Canada, nor it was like the American War of Independence. As already mentioned above, the India's freedom struggle oscillated between the boards of legal action and the working through limited democratic political institution offered by the British on the one hand, and extra legal agitational mass movement largely dominated by Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, subscribing to his strategy of non-violent satyagraha on the other. The foregoing process of evolutionary and revolutionary creation of the constitutions apart, their basic principles and operating norms also predictively diverge. The three essential ingredients of British constitutionalism, as classically deciphered by Albert Ben T.C., are parliamentary sovereignty, rule of law, and convention as that order. Neither the Crown nor the court can sit in judgment on the political wisdom of the Parliament. In the strict legal sense, the British Parliament is the source of all legislative, executive, judicial power, harboring the cabinet in the Commons as well as in the highest court of the appeal in the Lords, and now added by the Supreme Court since 2009. This is essentially a framework of majoritarian parliamentary democracy in theory, if not practice. Theoretically, again, the situation remains unchanged even after Britain's joining of the European Union and the creation of the Scottish Parliament. The practical consequences of the classical and contemporary limitation on the sovereignty of Parliament in London is, however, a different matter. The delight of the language of the formalism of the British mind seems to be limitless. Contrariwise, the U.S. constitutionalism was the product of a conscious deliberative designed by the constituent group assembled in the Philadelphia Convention 1787 to checkmate power by systematically separating the legislative, executive, and judicial powers of the government on the horizontal axis and dividing the powers of federal, regional government on the vertical axis. The makers of the American Constitution borrowed the constitutional theory of separation of powers from John Locke and Montesquieu and combined it with the newly created American theory of federal divisions of power, which produced in terms of the constitutional theory of institutional checks and balances among co-equal and the coordinate governmental organs. It has been slightly modified since the discovery of the power of the judicial review of the legislative and executive acts. On the touchstone of their conformity to the Constitution by Chief Justice John Marshall of the Supreme Court and Marbury versus Madison 1803, the institution of judicial review has grown stronger with the years, as evident in the statement famously made by the Charles Evans that the Constitution is what the judges say it is. Canada was the first country in the world that sought to combine the parliamentary principle of government with the federal principle. The constitutional province of the Canadian Parliamentary Federation expressed the desire to be federally united into one domination under the crown of the United Kingdom, with a constitution similar in the principle to the United Kingdom preamble to the British North America Act 1867, now renamed Canadian Constitution Act 1867 by an amendment in 1982. Adoption of the British parliamentary system and the American federalism to the Canadian conditions and the needs modified both these principles of government significantly fusion of the powers between the legislature and the cabinet in a parliamentary mode in Canada tempered the full-fledged separation of the powers as in the USA. The desire to create a federal union in Canada with a strong parliamentary center or federal government in Ottawa. Uh, also, considerably limited provincial autonomy. On the other hand, the federal division of powers in Canada, departing from the British unitary government, necessitated the need of for judicial umpiring or review of jurisdictional conflicts between the federal and the provincial government. This need was reinforced when Canada adopted the Charter of Rights and Freedom of the People under a new supplemental Canada Constitution Act of 1982. The hallmark of the judicial behavior in Canada has been one of the restraint as compared to the activism of the American judges. The advent of the 1982 Charter has caused a spurt of the judicial activism, but it is yet to be seen how far it would go. The idea of the parliamentary supremacy is still close to the Canadian heart. The Indian constitutionalism differs from all the three foregoing models outlined above, though it's partially partakes of all three, even though its legal system is essentially British in foundation and the principle. India's departure from the British brand of the parliamentary sovereignty is self-evident in the adoption of federal divisions of power and fundamental right of citizen in its constitution. Both imply limitation on the parliamentary sovereignty that the British Parliament does not have. The striking resemblance between the parliamentary federal constitutions of Canada and India arises from the decision of the British Parliament to design the Government of India Act 1935 on model of the Canada Constitution Act 1867, also enacted by the Mother Parliament, and the Constitutional Assembly of India is drafting the Constitution of Independent India relied heavily on the Government of India Act 1935 after an early spurt of the activism in the Nehru era on the issue of fundamental right to property and compensation for it in case of the accusation by the state judiciary subsequently fell in the line with the progressive socio-economic policies of Congress governments, displaying judicial restraint and the legalism reminiscent of the behavior of the judges and the Commonwealth parliamentary federations in Canada and Australia. However, by the end of the Nehru era and the fourth general election in 1967, the Supreme Court resumed its course of judicial activism, seeking first to restrain Parliament's power to amend the fundamental rights in the Constitution, but subsequently retreating and instead postulating in 1973 judicial doctrine of the unamendability of the basic structure or essential feature of the Constitution. In doing so, the courts extended judicial review, earlier limited to legislative and executive actions, to constitutional amendment. This is something even the US Supreme Court could never do under the Constitution. We will return to this theme in later section. Genesis. Looking back for the roots of the parliament in Indian history, we do not find feudal antecedents like the Lords and the Commons in the United Kingdom and the Three Estates in France. Vedic direct democratic institution of Sabhas, Samitis and Vedhatas and post-Vedic republican Ganasangha were superseded by the rise of the monarchical bureaucratic states in the ancient India. This political pattern of the royal benevolent despotism remained largely unchanged in the medieval India. The sultanas of Delhi tended to be chosen by the choice of the Turkish or Afghan nobles. The liberal and the orthodox faction of the Muslim-dominated Mughal nobility in alliance with successful successive monarchs influenced the state policy as well as succession. But the crystallization and institutionalization of the medieval Europe political institution was important for our purpose here. They lacked any semblance of representative and responsible government. Panchayats are supposed to have existed through India's hoary past, but besides being non-civic caste based before their statutory reincarnation after independence, they were an instrument of the local government. Hence, the historical antecedents of the parliament must be found in the Government of India Act and Acts of 1909, 1919, 1935 during the British Raj. But these British Indian democratic experiments suffered from two basic limitations. First, these bodies were partially elected earlier entirely nominated on limited franchise based on the property and education. The gradually extended franchise had reached 28.5% of the population in the Government of India Act 1935. Second, they lacked legislative autonomy from the executive powers of the Governor General and governors. The federal scheme under the 1935 Constitution Act could only be partially implemented at the provincial level, and the central government continued to work under the 1919 Constitution Act except for the establishment of the newly proposed Federal Court of India. This was due to refusal of the princely Indian states to join the proposed federal union. Indeed, B.C. Barrow at half have gone to the extent of remarking the structure and composition of legislative institution provided in the previous enactment did not in these circumstances furnish any satisfactory basis on which the legislatures and the independent India under the new constitution could be devised, and the Constituent Assembly had therefore to give thought to this matter without any guidance from the past. The Motilal Nehru Committee, appointed by all party conference in its report 1928, advocated a constitutional framework of the parliamentary federalism in the white commonwealth mode with the dominion states with the additional features like the certain degree of the proportional representation in the fundamental rights of the people, but it failed to get unqualified support of either the Indian National Congress or the Muslim League. The Lahore session of the Congress, chaired by the Jawaharlal Nehru in 1930, moved beyond the dominion status with its Purna Samaj, Purna Swaraj, complete independence, ritual religion. The Muslim League rejected it on several points from the perspective of the Muslim minorities, and the proceeded subsequently to demand a separate homeland for Muslims. At its Lahore success in 1940, the Constitutional Assembly of the Independent India, designing the Parliament of Union Government, adopted the Commonwealth Parliamentary Federal model of the Crown and the Parliament, but adapted it to the needs of the Republican India as the President and Parliament. The bicameral Parliament consists of the House of the People, Lok Sabha representing the nation, and the Council of State, Rajya Sabha representing the state of the Federal Union. Constituting the national first chambers and the federal second chamber was very complicated due to the knotty questions relating to the representation of the 500 old princely states, which had become independent after the lapse of the paramountcy of the British Crown over them under the Independence of India Act 1947, enacted by the British Parliament to accomplish to transfer of powers to successor state. But by the time the articles in the draft constitution came to be debated in the Constituent Assembly, the process of integration of the princely states to the Indian Union had more or less been completed by a mix of diplomatic and military action. The political map of the country had considerably been simplified. The former British provinces and the Indian states were merged into the newly created Federation States of the Indian Union. The direct election of the members of the Lok Sabha in the territorial election constituencies under the plurality electoral law was the universal view in the Constitutional Assembly. The hated British colonial practice of religion-based communal representation was rejected in favor of composite representation of the territorial constituency or community in general. The only departure from this pattern was the reservation of certain seats of the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribes in the area of their concentration on a consideration of their being part of the socially and educationally backward classes. The number of reserved seats should bear the same relationship to the total seats for a state as the proportion of the target communities. These reservations, originally made for 10 years, have been decennally extended for 70 years so far and are likely to continue beyond the present limit. The Y and large elite case and the community leaders belonging to the upper classes and the Constituent Assembly transcended narrow social divisions and acted out Burkean model of the representation 1854, according to which a representative is not a delegate but a trustee, morally autonomous to deliberate and act in a way that at times the short-term interests of the one's constituents can are sacrificed for the greater common goods and national interests at stake in the parliament. There was large diversity of ideas regarding the composition of the Council of State or Rajya Sabha. The draft constitution proposed a Council of States comprising two categories of the members: those indirectly elected by the elected members of the state legislature, those nominated by the president having special knowledge and practical experience in the literacy, artistic, scientific, educational, and administrative fields or in the agriculture, fisheries, engineering, or architecture. Professor K.T. Saha, Bihar General, moved an amendment to the foregoing, proposing instead that the parliamentary may by law establish a consultative council of representative of agriculture, industry, commerce, mining, forestry, and engineering, public utilities, social services, economists to advise the parliamentary and the council of ministers on all matters of the policy affecting these sectors' interests and prepare a scrutinize proposals for legislation concerning any of these items. Numbers in the brackets stand for number of the representatives. The amendment was negative. The text of the constitution finally divided in the favor of the bulk of the members indirectly elected to the represent states and 12 members to be nominated by the president having knowledge or practical experience in respect of the literature, science, art, and the social service. Those representing the states are elected by the elected members of the state legislative assemblies in accordance with the system of proportional representation by means of single transferable vote. Article 18. Bicameralism. Indian parliamentary system, like such system elsewhere, makes the Lok Sabha the repository of the collective responsibility of the Council of Ministers as well as accord it primacy in initiation of money bills and the final say in their passes through the parliament, holding the key of the parliamentary confidence and the government of the day and the grant of money for public expenditures to the government, both crucial to the government's very survival, will make the Lok Sabha and the prima donna on the political stage. The Indian federal system is less generous to Rajya Sabha in designing it as a federal second chamber. In the Constitutional Assembly, Loknath Misra, Odisha General, had pleaded for equal representation of states in Rajya Sabha. Professor K.T. Shah, Bihar General, argued for its direct election with each state allocated 5 seats. If accepted, these amendments in the draft constitution would have made the Rajya Sabha a more powerful and effective federal second chamber without undermining the parliamentary primacy and the integrity of the popularly elected national chambers, as in the Constitution of Australia. The Rajya Sabha seems to be originally designed by the makers of the constitution with a certain measures of the ambivalence by regard to the two axial principles of the government, parliamentarianism and the federalism. At the first glance, it appears that the Rajya Sabha is designed in a predominantly parliamentary mode. It gives the representation to the state on the principle of the proportion of the population rather than equal representation in federal units irrespective of their population size. It is subordinate to the Lok Sabha with regard to the parliamentary confidence rule and the financial legislation, even though it has been given equal powers with the Lok Sabha and other legislations. The provision for a joint session of the two chambers in the case of the disagreement would mean that the Lok Sabha with its larger membership would usually win, varying complex coalitional configuration across the two houses. Most commentators seems to have taken this line of the interpretation. One has even gone to the extent of the arguing that instead of being cast as a defender of the state rights, the Rajya Sabha instead can only take away the right of the state by resolving by a two-third majority of the members present and the voting by the valid quorum. Of course, the Union Parliament legislative legislate in the national interest on the subject of and the stateless, and the Union government creates a new All India service, a matter of the vital concern of the states. Even W. H. Morris Jones and his classical study of the Indian Parliament fails to find any appreciable federal relevance to the Rajya Sabha. For the Rajya Sabha, the upper house is a council of state of the union and its members are elected by the state assemblies. This, however, does not seem to have made the floor of the council's battleground between the center and states. If defense of state rights and expression of regional demands is just as likely to be heard in the other house. Even as parliamentary second chamber, Morris Jones 1957 1957 did not find the Rajya Sabha greatly relevant or useful. Similar in the members' socio-economic and political career background as well as in rules of procedure, the Rajya Sabha provided neither for technical revisions nor for a wider and more leisurely debate. The saving grace for the Rajya Sabha as second chamber, according to the Morris Jones, were the government had started using it at the site for the first initiation of the bills in conjunction with the Lok Sabha to lessen the burden of the primary initiation in the Lok Sabha. The Rajya Sabha was beginning to try its wing as the forum for grand and soaring debates. Though the two houses have similar procedures, the debate in the Rajya Sabha is less restrictive time-wise on account of its smaller size. The Rajya Sabha today does not function in the radically different way. However, the regionalization of the party system in 1980s at the state level and the dissociation of the national party system from the state party system since 1989 have invested the Rajya Sabha with a greater potential as a federal second chamber, and did arguably even the modestly designed Rajya Sabha in the constitution can have a greater federal relevance than the commentators have generally attributed to it. This is for the following reasons. First, it has not only equal powers with the Lok Sabha in the federally important matters of the constitutional amendment, but also a veto power of virtue of its silence in the constitution for the provision for a joint session of the two houses in case of the disagreement of the legislative will is missing in the case of the Constitution Amendment Bill. Second, the joint sitting of the two houses on legislation instead of always dividing one house versus may shape up in a more complex way in the terms of the coalition among the parties in the parliament as a whole. Third, the Rajya Sabha can block the intention of the federal government to legislate in the certain contingency on a stateless subject and to create a new all India service. So it would appear that an essential parliamentary interpretation as long as federal interpretation of the powers of the Rajya Sabha was a byproduct of one party dominated system and the early decades of the Indian Republic. The regionalization of the multi-party system and the onset of the federal coalition governments since the early 1990s have enormously enhanced the political maneuverability of the Rajya Sabha. Since the 1989 parliamentary elections, the coalition's majority of the government in the Lok Sabha has never been matched by the government majority in the Rajya Sabha. Both the government and the opposition find it necessary to fabricate a consensus for the passage of any law and constitutional amendment through the parliament. A 2003 amendment to the Representation of the People Act 1951, changing one of the qualifications of the Rajya Sabha members, domiciliary requirement of the territorial nexus over the state one represents has struck a severe blow to the federal character of this house. Strangely, even the Supreme Court has validated this amendment, and Kuldeep Nayyar versus Union of India 2006 SSC 1 SCC 1 selectively citing the opinion in the Constitutional Assembly of India and the nationalist constituent movement and the tilting and fever of quasi-federalism in the current movement and the mood of federal fervor and the pressure. The Justice M. Panchi Commission on the Center-State relation in its report submitted in March 2010 aptly recommends the Supreme Court's reasoning to reject the status of the upper house as representative of a state is respectfully submitted and is faulty and warrant reconsideration. Equally important, it is for the court to review its reluctance to accept the needs for the territorial link for being elected to the Council of State. The Constitutional Assembly dared to give support to the view that the Council of State was intended to give a say to the units in the affairs of the center. There was evidence to show that the equal representation formula was substituted by the weight proportional representation under the fourth schedule only to avoid extreme solution to difficult situation at the time of independence. And did this commission goes for the first time beyond the official discourse on the larger question of representation in and the role of Rajya Sabha as contained in the Constitutional Assembly debates, the text of the Constitution and reports of the Justice R.S. Sarkaria Commission on the Center-State Relation 1988, Volume 1, Chapter 2, in the interest of the restoring federal balance of the political forces in the Parliament, where smaller states are heavily outnumbered and their representation in the Lok Sabha as well as Rajya Sabha, and Panchi Commission recommends equal representation to states qua status irrespective of their demography and the geography. The commission goes on to suggest whenever central policies are formulated in the relation to one or more state, it is only proper that committees of the Rajya Sabha involving representatives of the concerned states are allowed to discuss and come up with alternative courses of action acceptable to states and union, thus compensating the mineral rich states or the hill states can well be negotiated in the Rajya Sabha committee. Similarly, state adversely affected by the center entering into treaties or arrange agreement with the other countries can get appropriate remedies if the forum of the Rajya Sabha is utilized for the purpose. These reforms would bring about an element of the legislative federalism in the intergovernmental affairs, where the executive federalism via inter-state council and national development council (PMCMs), ministerial secretarial conferences, and formal or informal forums has been the model norms. The new committee system ministry passed with specialized standing committee for detailed scrutiny of expenditure, administration, and the policy by Parliament is probably the most important reform in the parliamentary government in the last quarter of the 20th century. In 1979, the British House of the Commons moved in the direction of by formally establishing 14 departmentally related select committees, to which a 15th liaison committee consisting of the chairman of other select committees was added in 1980s. The committee was empowered to send for persons in the government records and list service of the specialist, and the appoint subcommittees in respect of 3 departments: Home Affairs, Treasury, and the Foreign Affairs. The developments have been viewed positively by the participant as well as by the procedure committee's formal inquiry 10 years after the establishment of the new committees. The reforms has also been welcomed by the media and the pressure groups. The journalists are much better informed about the parliamentary process than they were before these reforms. The pressure groups generally they see themselves as forming a triangle of influence, and the other 2 corner of which are occupied by the department is related select committees and the media. Following the recommendation of the Royal Commission of the Financial Management and Accountability chaired by the Alan Lambert, the Canadian Parliament also streamlined its committee system in the 1989. The reformed departmentally related standing committees then introduced and empowered to review and report on statutes, law, the programs and the policy implementation, expenditures plans and their implementation, and perform of the departments falling within the purview of parliamentary committees. The Indian Parliament made a beginning with the three select subject committees, one each on agriculture, science and technology, and the environmental forest in 1989. Encouraged by the experiment, the rules committee in the third report to the Lok Sabha in March 1999 recommended the establishment of 24 standing or select committees of parliament for the various ministries department. The committees were formally inaugurated on the 31 March 1993. Established under the rule 331C, the members of the committees are nominated by the Rajya Sabha chairman and the Lok Sabha speaker, and their chairmen are appointed by the speaker. Committee membership is for a year, while it allows for a larger number of the MPs to gain experience of committee work. The turnover is too quick to allow deeper interest and the specialization. Each of these committees consists of 31 members, 20 from the Lok Sabha and the 11 from Rajya Sabha. Party representation in the committee broadly reflects their parliamentary strength. The expectation of the rules committee is that consensus culture but prevail in the committee, but in a case a member wants, he can be allowed to give a dissenting note or minutes of dissent. Department related standing committees concern themselves with the analysis or review of policies, demand for grants and action taken. Reports among these committees finance table the maximum.